stared at the rejection email for the third time that morning, his coffee growing cold as the words burned into his consciousness. We've decided to move forward with another candidate who better fits our current needs. Another polite dismissal. Another door slammed shut. At 32, with a decade of experience in corporate strategy, he had somehow become invisible in a world that seemed to value everything except genuine competence. The irony wasn't lost on him as he sat in his cramped apartment, surrounded by business books that promised success through hard work, integrity, and playing by the rules. Those very principles had guided his career, leading him to mentor junior colleagues, share credit generously, and maintain transparent communication with his superiors. Yet here he was, watching less qualified individuals leapfrog over him into positions he had coveted for years. It was during this moment of bitter reflection that encountered a concept that would fundamentally alter his understanding of power dynamics in the modern workplace. The revelation came not from a best-selling business book or a motivational seminar, but from an unlikely source, a weathered copy of The Prince that his grandfather had left him, gathering dust on a forgotten shelf. As delved deeper into his observations about power, survival, and human nature, he began to recognize a pattern that had eluded him throughout his career. The most successful individuals in his organization weren't necessarily the most competent, instead, they possessed something far more valuable and far more dangerous. They had made themselves indispensable through strategic manipulation of dependencies, information control, and calculated relationship management. This realization marked the beginning of his transformation from an idealistic professional into a master practitioner of what he would later term strategic indispensability, the dark art of becoming so deeply embedded in an organization's critical functions that removing you becomes impossible, regardless of your actual performance or behavior. Part 1. The Architecture of Dependency. The morning after his revelation, arrived at his current position, a mid-level role at a Fortune 500 consulting firm, with new eyes. He began to observe his workplace not as a meritocracy where the best ideas and hardest workers prevailed, but as an ecosystem of dependencies, information asymmetries, and power relationships that could be systematically exploited. His first target was the monthly client reporting system, a tedious but critical process that his department handled for their largest accounts. The existing system was adequate but required multiple people to gather data from various sources, compile it into standardized reports, and distribute it to stakeholders. Volunteered to streamline this process, positioning himself as an efficiency-minded team player. Over the course of 6 weeks, methodically inserted himself into every aspect of the reporting workflow. He developed personal relationships with data sources in other departments, creating informal channels that bypassed official protocols. He designed a new template that appeared more professional, but actually required his specific knowledge of custom formulas and data manipulation techniques to operate effectively. Most cunningly, he embedded subtle dependencies into the process that made it nearly impossible for anyone else to complete without his direct involvement. The key insight had absorbed from was the principle of controlled indispensability. Rather than making himself valuable through exceptional performance that others might replicate, he made himself necessary through the creation of systems that could not function without his unique knowledge and access. This approach had several distinct advantages. It was difficult for others to recognize as manipulation. It created genuine value for the organization, even if achieved through ethically questionable means, and it established a foundation for further power accumulation. Within 2 months, had become the de facto owner of client reporting across the entire division. When his manager attempted to delegate some of his responsibilities to other team members, they discovered that the process had created was far more complex than it appeared on the surface. The custom Excel macros required passwords that only knew. The data sources he had cultivated would only respond promptly to his requests. The client preferences and formatting requirements had been documented in a way that was technically accurate, but practically useless without knowledge. The beauty of this strategy lay in its apparent legitimacy. Wasn't hoarding information or refusing to help colleagues, quite the opposite. He was always willing to assist others, to share his knowledge, and to take on additional responsibilities. However, his help invariably increased rather than decreased their dependence on him. When a colleague asked him to explain how to generate a particular report, would provide a comprehensive tutorial that required so many steps and special considerations that the colleague would inevitably conclude. It was more efficient to simply ask to handle it directly. This pattern of helpful dependency creation became signature approach. He identified critical but underappreciated functions within the organization and systematically made them his domain. He became the person everyone turned to for specific types of analysis, certain client relationships, and particular technical processes. Each area of expertise was carefully chosen to be important enough to provide leverage, but specialized enough to prevent easy replication. The psychological aspect of this strategy proved equally important. Understood that people don't just depend on others for technical capabilities. They depend on them for confidence, reassurance, and the comfort of familiar routines. By consistently delivering reliable results in his areas of specialty, became not just a functional necessity, but an emotional security blanket for his colleagues and superiors. He observed how his manager, Sarah, began to visibly relax during client presentations when was present to handle data questions. He noticed how the sales team started scheduling their proposals around his availability, knowing that his input significantly increased their success rates. He watched as senior executives began to specifically request his involvement in strategic discussions, not because they couldn't proceed without him, but because his presence made them feel more confident about their decisions. This emotional dependency proved far more powerful than mere functional necessity. While technical skills could theoretically be replaced or automated, the psychological comfort that provided was irreplaceable. He had become not just useful but indispensable to the emotional equilibrium of his workplace ecosystem. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. His calendar filled with meetings where his input was deemed essential. His email inbox overflowed with requests for his expertise and guidance. His opinion was sought on matters that extended far beyond his official job description. Within 6 months, he had evolved from a replaceable mid-level employee into a critical component of his organization's operational infrastructure. The most Machiavellian aspect of his approach was how he managed the visibility of his influence. He carefully avoided appearing power-hungry or manipulative. Instead, he cultivated an image of reluctant indispensability, someone who had simply become essential through competence and helpfulness rather than ambition. This perception was crucial because it prevented the kind of scrutiny and resistance that more obvious power grabs might have triggered. When opportunities for promotion arose, found himself in an unprecedented position. Rather than competing desperately with other candidates, he was actively recruited by hearing managers who recognized that losing him would create significant operational disruptions. The dependencies he had created made the cost of his departure unacceptably high, effectively removing him from the pool of replaceable employees and placing him in the much smaller category of individuals whose retention was a strategic priority. Part 2, the of knowledge. As his influence grew, he began to understand a more sophisticated dimension of strategic indispensability, the manipulation of information flow within the organization. He recognized that in the modern knowledge economy, power derived not just from controlling what people needed to do their jobs, but from controlling what they needed to know to make decisions. This insight led to develop what he privately called information architecture, a systematic approach to becoming the primary conduit for critical knowledge within his organization. Unlike simple information hoarding, which was easily recognizable and typically punished, his approach involved becoming so deeply embedded in information networks that removing him would effectively blind the organization to essential data streams. The strategy began with volunteering to serve as the liaison between his department and several external vendors, regulatory agencies, and industry associations. These roles were typically viewed as administrative burdens that more senior employees preferred to delegate. Embrace them enthusiastically, recognizing them as opportunities to establish himself as the organization's primary interface with crucial external information sources. Over time, cultivated relationships with key contacts at regulatory agencies who knew him by name and trusted his interpretation of policy changes. He became the person vendors called first when they had new products or services to discuss. Industry associations began to route important communications through him, knowing he would ensure proper distribution within his organization. These relationships appeared to benefit everyone involved, but they also created a web of dependencies that flowed through as a central hub. The true genius of this approach emerged when began to subtly shape how information was presented and interpreted within his organization. He didn't alter facts or misrepresent data. Such obvious manipulation would have been quickly detected and severely punished. Instead, he influenced the context, timing, and emphasis of information sharing in ways that enhanced his perceived value and made his interpretation seem indispensable. When regulatory changes occurred in their industry, would be among the first to know through his external relationships. Rather than immediately sharing this information broadly, he would first analyze its implications, prepare detailed briefings, and develop preliminary strategic recommendations. By the time he distributed the information to colleagues and superiors, it came packaged with his insights and recommendations, making it difficult for others to separate the raw data from its interpretation. This pattern repeated across multiple information streams. Market intelligence, competitive analysis, vendor negotiations, and regulatory compliance all flowed through his framework. He became not just a source of information, but the primary lens through which his organization understood its external environment. Colleagues and superiors began to rely not just on his access to information, but on his ability to make sense of it. The psychological impact of this information dependency was profound. Decision-makers found themselves genuinely unable to evaluate complex situations without its input, not because they lacked the intellectual capacity, but because they lacked the contextual knowledge and external relationships that informed his analysis. Had made his cognitive processes an integral part of the organization's decision-making infrastructure. This information control strategy extended beyond external relationships to internal knowledge management. Volunteered to document critical processes, maintain institutional knowledge databases, and serve as the organizational memory for important decisions and their rationales. He approached these responsibilities with apparent diligence and transparency, creating comprehensive documentation that seemed to eliminate rather than increase dependency. However, this documentation followed a subtle but consistent pattern. Written procedures were technically accurate but assumed familiarity with context that only possessed. Historical decision records were complete but organized in ways that required guidance to navigate effectively. Knowledge databases were comprehensive, but used categorization systems and search methodologies that had designed and that others found difficult to use independently. The cumulative effect was that became the organization's facto chief knowledge officer, not through formal appointment but through systematic infiltration of information management systems. Colleagues could access the data they needed, but they increasingly relied on to help them find it, interpret it, and apply it to current situations. This information architecture strategy proved particularly powerful during periods of organizational change. When leadership turnover occurred, new executives found themselves dependent on institutional knowledge to understand the context behind existing policies and practices. When strategic initiatives were launched, project teams discovered that historical perspective and external relationships were essential for avoiding past mistakes and leveraging existing opportunities. Carefully managed the perception of his growing information influence by consistently presenting himself as a resource rather than a gatekeeper. He never refused to share information or help colleagues access what they needed. Instead, he made sharing information and providing access so complex and time-consuming that people naturally gravitated toward asking him to handle information-related tasks directly rather than attempting to navigate the systems themselves. The most sophisticated aspect of his information strategy was how he managed the transition from being helpful to being indispensable. He gradually shifted from teaching others how to access and interpret information to simply providing them with the results of his analysis. This transition appeared to be driven by efficiency, could gather and analyze information much more quickly than he could teach others to do it themselves. However, it had the effect of making his colleagues increasingly dependent on his cognitive processes, rather than just his access to data. By the end of his second year in the position, had achieved a remarkable transformation in his professional status. He was no longer evaluated primarily on his individual performance, but on his contribution to the organization's overall decision-making capabilities. His value was measured not by what he produced, but by what the organization could produce with his support versus what it could accomplish without him. This shift in how his value was perceived had profound implications for job security and advancement prospects. Traditional performance metrics, productivity, quality, efficiency, became secondary to his strategic importance. Even if individual output declined, his overall value to the organization continued to increase as long as his information networks and capabilities remained essential to organizational functioning. The mastery of strategic indispensability. In his third year of implementing these Machiavellian strategies, reached what he considered the pinnacle of professional chess mastery. He had become so fundamentally integrated into his organization's operational and decision-making infrastructure that his departure would constitute an existential threat to multiple critical business functions. This wasn't merely job security. It was the transformation of his employment relationship from a contractual arrangement that could be terminated to a strategic partnership that the organization couldn't afford to lose. The sophistication of his position became clear during his annual performance review. Rather than the traditional evaluation focused on his individual contributions and areas for improvement, the conversation centered on how the organization could better support its expanding responsibilities and ensure his continued engagement with the company. His manager, Sarah, had been promoted to director largely based on the department's improved performance that everyone understood was inextricably linked to specialized capabilities. The review process revealed the true genius of long-term strategy. When Sarah attempted to discuss professional development goals, she found herself in the unusual position of having to convince him to consider advancement opportunities rather than having to decide whether he deserved them. Multiple departments had expressed interest in having contribute to their operations, and senior leadership was eager to expand his influence throughout the organization. This demand for his involvement created a new dynamic in his professional relationships. Instead of competing for opportunities, he was in the enviable position of being able to select which projects and responsibilities aligned with his strategic interests. Each new role he accepted was carefully chosen to either strengthen his existing areas of indispensability or to establish new domains of influence that would further cement his position. The most telling indicator of strategic success was how the organization responded to the possibility of his departure. When a competing firm attempted to recruit him with a significantly higher salary offer, the response from his current organization was swift and comprehensive. Rather than simply matching the financial offer, they proposed a restructuring of his role that would formalize much of the informal influence he had accumulated and provide him with resources to expand his capabilities further. The counteroffer included not just increased compensation, but also a budget for hearing assistants who could help him manage his expanding responsibilities, access to advanced training and certification programs that would enhance his expertise, and a commitment to involving him in strategic planning processes at the highest levels of the organization. Most remarkably, the proposal included provisions that would make him partially responsible for developing succession plans for his own areas of expertise, effectively giving him influence over who might eventually be capable of replacing him. This response demonstrated that had achieved the ultimate goal of his Machiavellian campaign. He had made the organization more afraid of losing him than confident in their ability to replace him. The cost and complexity of transitioning his responsibilities to others had become so daunting that prevention of his departure took precedence over all other considerations. The psychological dimensions of strategic position proved as important as the operational ones. His colleagues and superiors had become so accustomed to relying on his capabilities that the prospect of functioning without him generated genuine anxiety. This emotional dependency manifested in various ways: reluctance to make important decisions without his input, automatic inclusion of him in strategic discussions regardless of their official scope, and a general assumption that his involvement would improve outcomes across a wide range of activities. Observed how meetings would be postponed if he couldn't attend, how strategic initiatives would be delayed until he could provide input, and how problems that arose in his areas of expertise would wait for his return from vacation rather than being addressed by temporary alternatives. This pattern revealed that his indispensability had transcended mere functional necessity and had become a form of organizational anxiety disorder. The organization had lost confidence in its ability to operate effectively without his constant presence and guidance. The mastery of his position allowed to begin implementing what he considered the final phase of his strategy. the creation of a sustainable empire of influence that could continue to grow even as he moved into more senior positions. This involved carefully mentoring selected colleagues and subordinates, not to replace him, but to extend his influence into areas where he couldn't be personally involved. His approach to mentoring followed the same principles that had guided his individual strategy. He taught his to become indispensable within their own domains while maintaining dependency on his oversight and guidance. Each person he developed became, in effect, an extension of his influence rather than a potential replacement. They learned to solve problems using methodologies he had developed, to build relationships that reinforced his networks, and to create value in ways that enhanced rather than competed with his strategic position. The result was the creation of what privately called his indispensability network, a group of colleagues whose professional success was directly tied to his continued presence and influence within the organization. This network provided him with intelligence about developments throughout the company, advocacy for his interests in discussions where he wasn't present, and a distributed system for maintaining his influence even when he couldn't be personally involved in every relevant decision. The most Machiavellian aspect of this network was how it appeared to benefit everyone involved while actually strengthening his position. His gained access to accelerated career development, insider knowledge, and protection from organizational politics. The organization benefited from improved performance and reduced coordination costs. Yet the underlying structure ensured that these benefits would disappear if were to leave, creating a powerful incentive for everyone involved to support his continued prominence within the company. As reflected on his transformation from a struggling mid-level employee to an indispensable organizational asset, he recognized that his success hadn't come from abandoning ethical considerations entirely, but from redefining them within a framework that prioritized strategic thinking over naive idealism. He had learned to create value for others, while ensuring that this value remained tied to his personal involvement. He had developed expertise that genuinely benefited his organization, while making that expertise difficult to replicate or replace. The moral complexity of his approach reflected the broader reality of modern organizational life. Success often depends more on strategic positioning than on pure merit, and those who understand this reality are likely to thrive, while those who ignore it may struggle despite their competence and dedication. His journey illustrated how Machiavellian principles could be applied within legitimate professional contexts to achieve outcomes that traditional approaches might not deliver. The ultimate test of strategic mastery came when the organization faced significant economic pressures that required substantial cost reductions and workforce downsizing. While many talented employees found themselves vulnerable to layoffs, his position remained secure not because he was protected by favoritism or office politics, but because eliminating his role would have created operational disruptions that the organization couldn't afford during a period of crisis. The downsizing process actually strengthens position by eliminating some of the redundancies that had previously existed in his areas of expertise. As other employees were let go, their responsibilities were redistributed in ways that further concentrated critical functions under his control. The organization's reduced workforce made his contributions even more essential, as there were fewer people available to provide backup or alternative approaches to the challenges he addressed. This outcome validated his fundamental insight. In an uncertain economic environment, job security comes not from being a good employee, but from being an irreplaceable employee. Traditional approaches to career development, working hard, following rules, and hopping for recognition, provide little protection against organizational changes that are driven by financial pressures rather than individual merit. Story illustrates the dark but effective art of strategic indispensability, the systematic creation of dependencies that make one's organizational position immune to the normal vicissitudes of corporate life. While his methods raise ethical questions about manipulation and the exploitation of trust, they also demonstrate how traditional career advice often fails to address the realities of modern workplace dynamics. The principles employed, dependency creation, information control, and network building, represent a sophisticated understanding of organizational psychology and power dynamics. These principles can be applied ethically by individuals who want to increase their professional security and influence without engaging in genuinely harmful manipulation. The key is to create value while making that value difficult to replicate, to share knowledge while maintaining expertise, and to build relationships that benefit others while strengthening one's own position. The most important lesson from transformation may be the recognition that professional success in complex organizations requires strategic thinking that goes beyond simple competence and hard work. Those who master the art of making themselves indispensable, whether through ethical or more questionable means, will find themselves with career options and security that remain elusive to equally talented individuals who fail to understand the strategic dimensions of organizational life. This approach ultimately succeeded because it aligned his personal interests with organizational needs in ways that made his influence self-reinforcing. Each increase in his responsibility and authority created new opportunities to expand his indispensability. Each demonstration of his value made the organization more dependent on his continued contributions. Each relationship he cultivated strengthened his position while providing genuine benefits to others. This alignment between personal strategy and organizational value represents the highest form of professional chess mastery, the ability to advance one's own interests through actions that genuinely benefit others, even when those others don't fully understand the strategic implications of their increasing dependence. It's a dark art, perhaps, but one that reflects the complex realities of power and influence in the modern workplace, more accurately than the simplistic narratives of meritocracy and fairness that dominate traditional career advice. In the end, achieved something that few professionals ever attain: true job security in an insecure world, genuine influence in decisions that matter, and the satisfaction of knowing that his professional survival depends on his strategic intelligence rather than the arbitrary whims of economic forces or organizational politics. Whether one views his methods as brilliant strategy or manipulative exploitation may depend largely on one's own relationship with power and willingness to acknowledge the darker truths about how success is actually achieved in complex human organizations. The Machiavellian trick of becoming dangerously irreplaceable isn't simply about manipulation or exploitation. It's about understanding the fundamental nature of power in organizational contexts and positioning oneself to thrive within those realities rather than being victimized by them. For those willing to embrace this understanding and apply it with sophistication and restraint, the rewards can be transformative. For those who prefer to maintain faith in simpler narratives about merit and fairness, story serves as a cautionary tale about the limitations of traditional approaches to professional development in an increasingly complex and competitive world.